we are now starting our next session, A Case for Juntos. So I would like to introduce Dr. Rebecca Tippett. Dr. Rebecca Tippett is the founding director of Carolina Demography at the Carolina Population Center at UNC Chapel Hill and oversees the operation of the organization. Her work helps leaders across North Carolina make sense of population level changes throughout the state. Since 2017, her work and the work of Carolina Demography has largely focused on evaluating North Carolina's post-secondary educational pipeline. In collaboration with John M. Belk Endowment, Carolina Demography has mapped out a complete picture of North Carolina's post-secondary educational pipeline and identified the biggest opportunities for improvement. Using the data from K through 12, North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, the North Carolina Community College Systems, and the University of North Carolina System, Tippett and Carolina Demography followed ninth graders in North Carolina through the state's public education institutions for 10 years and determined where they are most likely to drop out of the educational pipeline. They examined how educational attainment across the state varies by demography and geography. Her ongoing work examines the full range of post-secondary outcomes, including private and out-of-state enrollments, and takes a more detailed look at a sub-state variation in outcomes. So prior to joining UNC, Dr. Tippett worked at the University of Virginia's Weldon Cooper Center for Public Service, where she produced population estimates and population projections for Virginia's 134 counties and independent cities. A transplant to North Carolina from the Midwest, she earned her BA in Sociology and Political Science from The Ohio State University and her MA and PhD in Sociology from Duke University. Welcome, Dr. Rebecca Tippett.
Thank you, Juan, and thank you so much for having me. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because, as you may have intuited, I tend to talk a lot about data, and it's very hard to have data without slides. So we're going to go over some kind of really high-level look today. I want to be really clear about a few things. First and foremost, about terminology. So the title of this presentation is really pretty big picture, right? We're looking at Hispanic or Latino community in the United States. And I just want to be really clear about terminology. So the term Hispanic was what the Census Bureau initially began to use. And in the 90s, the term Latino or Latina became more common. And so Hispanic or Latino was what was adopted by the US Census Bureau and the Federal Office of Management and Budget as official guidelines. More recently, in the past decade, you may have heard the gender neutral term Latinx become more popular. Just for kind of simplicity to say one term, I am going to use the term Hispanic or Latino, sticking with the official terms today, and I will use those terms interchangeably. So either going to say Hispanic or Latino throughout. So brief, really high level picture of Carolina demography, because you may be saying, you know, you're a North Carolina organization, we're 13 states here representing, you know, not just North Carolina, but multiple other states. But our real role is that while we focus on North Carolina, we work with publicly available data and some non-publicly available data from around the state and also around the country to really understand how and why population is changing. And so that's either going to be, we know where to go to get the data, we know how to analyze and interpret it, we might create my favorite stuff, which is custom population estimates and projections, or more frequently, we're taking our findings from that work and then facilitating out in terms of workshops, trainings, or presentations like today to help others understand what to do with that data. I believe that you were sent prior to today. There's a data book that we have for both the current Juntos partner states and the states that are considering partnering with Juntos. There's 13 in total. And we have a lot of the data that I'll be showing today. It's not feasible for me to show breakdowns for all 13 states. And quite frankly, your eyes would glaze over and probably wouldn't really enjoy this that much. But that data book, all of the stuff that I could get at a good state level is included in that data book for your state. So I want to start with a look at the Hispanic population kind of by the numbers at the big picture level, and then we'll transition into looking specifically at what this means for education. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the US view, or kind of the total view as much as possible, drill down by state where possible. And then for some of the education pipeline work, I'm going to draw specifically from our research in North Carolina to help really illuminate some of the findings that we're seeing. I do want to caveat that North Carolina is a little unique, maybe compared to some of these other contexts, and I'll try to make sure that I point out how what we're seeing in North Carolina may be a little bit more pronounced, but is going to be consistent with patterns that we see across the United States. So first and foremost, you should know that as of 2019, which is the most current population estimate, there were more than 60 million Hispanic residents in the United States. More than half of those residents, about 34 million, were in one of the 13 states represented here today on this call. And so we have a very large Hispanic population, and that population has been growing substantially over the past few decades. So if we go back at the national level, this chart's going to look at the Hispanic population in millions from 1980 to present day. So in 1980, just about under 15 million Hispanic residents. So 6.5% of the US population, which is about 1 in 15 individuals identifying as Hispanic. That population grew pretty substantially between 1980 and 1990. And then when we hit the 90s, we really see this population expand significantly. So we see, a growth of 14 million individuals between 1990 and 2000. We add about slightly more, another 15 million between 2000 and 2010. And another 10 million over the past 9 years. So we expect to see this population grow even more, probably around 61 to 62 million by the time we get the 2020 census numbers. But as of today, the share, not only has the population increased by a factor of 4, but the share of the US population that Hispanics comprise has nearly tripled. So today, Hispanics make up about 18.5% of the US population. So from 1 in 15 residents to about 1 in 5. So when we look at that population growth, the pace of growth has slowed a little bit because the population is relatively larger, but the US Hispanic population increased by 20% since 2010, the last census. In many of the states, this was much faster. So North Carolina, it was 28%, for example. Among the partner states or potential partners here today, the highest rate was in Pennsylvania, which is, I think, a growth of 39%. And you can see on this map that the fastest growth was in places like the Dakotas and Montana. Some of this is because these populations were very small in those states to begin with. But I think an important takeaway is that the Hispanic population is growing in all 50 states in DC. And in many places, both at the state level or at the local level, sometimes the growth of the Hispanic population is one of the things that is helping to buffer other population losses, to either kind of offset them completely or to help mitigate against really bad population declines. So for example, West Virginia and Maine overall are losing residents because of population aging, but the Hispanic population in those places is growing rather significantly. So it would be a worse decline if it weren't for the Hispanic population. So when we look at the share of the population that is Hispanic, you can see that very clearly. The Southwest and Florida have a very high concentration of Hispanic residents, where more than 1 in 4 residents there are Hispanic, which is above the national average. As you know, part of this is that we're kind of seeing that as migration patterns mature. And so individuals may first migrate into Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California. And then as as time goes on, those families may move further into the United States to further flung states. So that's one of the things that we see in North Carolina, for example, is we were not a primary destination, but we were a secondary destination in North Carolina. You can also see that Florida and then New York and New Jersey do serve as significant points of entry, and the composition of the Hispanic population in those states is very different than in the Southwest. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a few minutes. One of the things that's important to keep in mind is what's driving this growth. So from a demographic perspective, we can really have 2 ways that a population grows and changes. The first is you can have what's called the natural factors, right? You have more babies being born, then more people are dying. The second is from migration. You have more people moving in than moving out. And for a while, it was really easy to say, you know, so much of this Hispanic population growth is due to migration. But over the past 13 years, migration has not been a major source of the Hispanic population growth. We have seen continued migration, particularly shifting to maybe some Central American countries over Mexico. It's hard to see here, but you actually had some negative reverse migration after the Great Recession, because a lot of the migration, if it's responding to economic conditions, will shift as the conditions in the US are worse, for example. At the same time, we're seeing really significant growth in the US born population. So this is in part because the median age of the Hispanic population is relatively young. So what we know from a demographic perspective is that when you are younger, you are less likely to die and you are more likely to have a child. So we're seeing that in the Hispanic population, where the majority of our Latino population in the United States is US born, and that share is increasing. So as of the most current estimates, 2 and 3, 67% of our Hispanic population was born in the United States. And that's going to be even more among the child population. But this looks very different from state to state. So I want to highlight just a few states here because we can see how there's some really big differences. So the Juntos 13 state total tracks pretty similarly to the US as a whole. So overall, on average, the 13 states that are here today kind of represent pretty aligned with the United States as a whole. Florida and North Carolina in 2006 had much fewer residents than, had much fewer US born share than the Juntos average or the national average. And Pennsylvania, in contrast, about 3 in every 4, 77% of individuals were born in the United States. When we jump forward to 2018, again, you see that the Juntos, the national share shifted up 7 percentage points, Juntos shifted up 7 percentage points. Florida also shifted to higher share US born, 7 percentage points, but remains much more likely to be foreign born than the national average or other states in the Juntos partnership. North Carolina, in contrast, you can see how maybe my expertise in North Carolina was not always going to be a direct relationship to the United States, because North Carolina went from being majority foreign born to strongly majority US born in a 19 percentage point swing over just 12 years. Pennsylvania, meanwhile, really didn't change that much. You see similar percentage are US born. And that's in large part because the bulk of Pennsylvania's Hispanic population, almost half, identifies as Puerto Rican. So Puerto Rican individuals are not going to be foreign born, they're US citizens. So that's important to keep in mind, that there's a lot of diversity among the Hispanic population in the United States. When we look at Ancestry, so this is anybody who is claiming Hispanic origin, regardless of where they were born. So this will be both foreign and US born individuals. The majority of individuals are identifying as Mexican, about 62%. And the next largest share, specific share, is Puerto Rican. So those are going to be the 2 most common nationally, but we're going to see really big differences across the states. So for example, California is predominantly Mexican origin. We've already seen that Pennsylvania has a high share of Puerto Rican. Cuban is the next most common nationally, but in Florida is the largest single group. Salvadoran does not have a kind of plurality in any state, but it's going to vary from state to state. In North Carolina, for example, it's slightly higher share than the nation at large. Dominican, meanwhile, is the 5th most common nationally, but in New York is one of the most common. So I think that's really important to keep in mind, that not only is this population diverse nationally, but within your specific state, you may have a very, or even your specific region in your state, you may have a very different Latino community than the top line statistics would suggest. So it's important to understand that there's a lot of difference within these communities. Additionally, when we look just at foreign-born individuals, again, we see that there's a lot of different countries represented. So you have Mexico is going to be, like, again, the leading country for foreign-born Hispanics. But you can see here that while Cuba was the third most common ancestry, Puerto Rico is not going to show up here because, again, it's not foreign-born. But El Salvador is now actually slightly larger than Cuba for place of birth. So that means that our Cuban individuals may be more likely to be US born, while the Salvadoran individuals are more likely to be foreign born. And you can see here in the remaining top 10 foreign born countries of birth that you see a significant influence both of the Caribbean, like the Dominican Republic and Cuba, but also Central America and South America with Guatemala, Colombia, Honduras, Peru, Ecuador, and Venezuela, really representing a pretty diverse mix. I'm sorry, guys, I have a cough or something. It's no longer so humid. So that's kind of the high level picture of what is going on with the population. My computer is freezing. Oops. And we're going to turn and talk about education if I can get my slides to move forward. So apologize for this technical glitch. Juan, I don't know if you want to take screen sharing away from me and pop up.
Yeah, let me see right now. I'm gonna see if I can find the.
I had some nice ways to move through it, but if I can't do anything, it's not that helpful.
Give me one moment. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen.
Okay.
One moment. It looks like it does it in a Google Doc. Ooh, I am so
Oh,
give me one moment.
do you have the PDF that I sent? I can also try again and see if it won't freeze.
Try that while I download this.
Okay.
Ah, it was sent over as a PDF. Okay.
Sorry.
All good.
I'm going to try to close that. Anything else? All right. So share again. Okay, so let's hope that this works. So we're now on to educational outcomes. And Juan, if you can maybe just get the PDF queued up in the background in case this happens again.
I gotcha.
That'd be great. So now we want to shift from kind of the population as a whole to looking really at kind of who's going to be entering educational systems, whether K-12 or making that transition into college. So one of the reasons why, I think that the subtitle on this, more broadly, a case for Juntos, is when we look at the growth of the Hispanic population, the influence of the Hispanic population is definitely clear in our working age population, but it's most significant in the child population. So this chart looks at the composition of various age groups by race and ethnicity. And you can see that in our oldest population, 65 and older, that's 74%, nearly 3 in every 4 identify as non-Hispanic white. You can see that there's some diversity there, but overall it's overwhelmingly white. There's a variety of factors going into that, but that share drops significantly as we go down to the younger age groups. And under age 25, you actually can see a population that becomes what would be called majority minority. And much of that is due to 2 factors. One is due to the much greater share of the Hispanic population among younger age groups. So that's 31% of under 10 and 30% of 10 to 17-year-olds are Hispanic. So that's nearly 1 in 3 in that age group. But also because we're seeing that dark gray bar at the end, a rising share of what we would call potentially other race or multiracial here, because, and that's a kind of a category that includes other race, multiracial, and American Indian. I'll tell you that almost all of that growth in the young ages there is due to multiracial children, because as we get a more diverse adult population, we tend to have a more diverse child population. So as of 2018, there were 18.6 million Hispanic children in the United States. So a very large portion of the Hispanic population is under 18. And that means that many of them, too, it's important to keep in mind that almost all of them, 94%, are US born. And this ranges from, I think the lowest state that is about 88% in Florida to a high of 97% in some of the other states. But important takeaway is that the vast majority of school-age children in your state are going to be US born citizens. But one of the challenges we see when we think about moving into education is that some of the outcomes for these students lag behind kind of their average, and particularly behind their white and Asian peers. So I'm going to go through a few different educational outcomes right now. We're going to start with high school, and then we'll transition into post-secondary, and talk a little bit at the end about what might be some of the complicating factors. So one of the things that we see at the national level, Hispanic students are less likely to complete high school on time. So the overall, this is for all racial ethnic subgroups, that first bar is for all students. So 85% of all ninth graders graduate high school within 4 years, only 81% of Hispanics, which is above Black and American Indian averages, but 8 percentage points below white students and 11 percentage points below Asian students. So when we're talking about the transition to college, one of the first hurdles is that students may be even less likely to be graduating high school and being able to navigate that transition. When we look specifically at the Juntos states that are evaluated here, we can see that in Florida and Missouri are the states with the highest Hispanic student graduation rate. What's really interesting there is that among these states, Florida has a very high share of Hispanic residents. Missouri has a very small share of Hispanic residents. So there's not a consistent pattern among these states as to what's going on. But we do see that this ranges, from a low of 72% in New York to a high of 85% in Florida. But again, keep in mind that that national average for white students is 89%. So there's probably, if we look at each of these states individually, there would likely be some gaps between those subgroups within those states, which is something we see in North Carolina as well. When we're talking about high school graduates, next thing we look at from our work is kind of intentions to enroll in post-secondary. And so now I'm shifting specifically to a North Carolina context, because our work looks specifically at that interest and transition to post-secondary, as well as success in post-secondary for North Carolina graduates. You saw before that North Carolina may be a little unique from in our Latino population, because we are a relatively new receiving state for Hispanic immigrants. It's a large population here, over 1 million Hispanics that represent about 10% of our population, but maybe not as established as some of the other states. So keep in mind that the patterns that I'm showing you here are consistent with broad trends that we see nationwide, but the way that they look in your specific state may be either more or less pronounced depending on kind of what populations you are working with. So one of the things that we are really lucky in North Carolina, so every high school graduate is asked what they plan to do after high school graduation, what they plan to do for the next year. And about 1 in 3, 31% across the board say that they plan to go to a University of North Carolina system school. That's a 4-year public institution. So NC State, if they're coming from Wake County Public Schools and they say they want to go to NC State, they would be captured in this number. And you can see that that's pretty consistent for all students. Over half of Asian students report that. But then we look at Hispanic students, and less than 1 in 5, just 19% of Hispanic students are reporting an intention to go to a 4-year public university. Instead, Hispanic students are much more likely to report that their intention, their first post-secondary intention, is a community college. So 43% of our Hispanic high school graduates report a community college intention, which is higher than any other subgroup and 9 percentage points higher than the average intention among graduates. But that puts them at kind of a similar share of intending to go to an in-state public post-secondary institution. But then we look at intentions to go to another type of post-secondary, whether that's a private institution in-state or post-secondary institution in another state, whether that's public or private. And you see that that share is also much smaller. So Hispanic students much more likely to report community college intent, and then they're also much more likely to report in general that they are not going to go to post-secondary, but that they are going to go to work, join the military, or do something else, which may be domestic homemaking, or kind of saying, I don't know. But the majority of that 29% is going to be work with a small portion military. So what this says is not only are Hispanic students slightly less likely to graduate high school, when they do graduate, they may not be intending to go to post-secondary at the same rate as their peers. Or in North Carolina's case, they definitely are not. And the type of institution that they're planning on going to is strongly biased towards community colleges. So then we look at what's actually going on. So we use National Student Clearinghouse data to look at the percentage of high school graduates who enrolled in any post-secondary institution in the fall semester after they graduated high school. So we'd call that on-time enrollment. And to make sure that we aren't capturing any significant, in fact, this is the 8-year average for 2009 through 2016 graduates, because it has some time period shifts. But overall, the pattern is consistent. About 57% of all students immediately transition to college, but only 38% of Hispanic students immediately transition. We'd hope to see that number go up over time, but it remains persistently low compared to all students, and in particular to white and Asian peers. So when we look at that, that's concerning, because what we know is that once students get into post-secondary, they have really high quality outcomes. So when we look at persistence, Hispanic students are persist at very high rates. About 79% continue to their second year, compared to 81% of all students. So that's slightly below white student persistence rates, but it's much closer. The gap is much smaller than what we're seeing in other factors that are leading to post-secondary. We do see a large gap in 6-year completion, but again, it's not nearly as large as the gap for American Indian or Black students. So one of the factors driving this 45% of degree completion within 6 years is that Hispanic students, consistent with their preferences stated at graduation, are much more likely to enroll in a 2-year program. They may be more likely to enroll part-time, and both of those factors are associated with lower likelihood of earning a degree. So again, I said this is North Carolina specific data, but these patterns are consistent with trends that we see nationally. And it's important to know that for Hispanic students, the big driver of lower attainment overall is in that transition to post-secondary. So a lot of the work for that population is going to be very much focused on helping those high school graduates identify and transition into post-secondary institutions. And I want to talk very briefly about why this might be going on. And one of the biggest challenges that we see for our Latino children is that many of them are coming from households where they or maybe their siblings would be the first person in that household to really earn a college degree. So when we look at children in the United States by race and ethnicity and the highest educational attainment of their parents, you can see that about half of Hispanic children, compared to 28% of all children, live in a household where the highest attainment of a parent or a guardian is high school diploma or less. So those households, the parental unit has no experience with post-secondary. If we make a slightly more expansive definition, we could say, okay, they have a high school diploma and they've attended some college, but they don't have a post-secondary degree. So we include those kind of partway home adults in our estimates. We see that 70% of Hispanic children, compared to 49% of all children nationwide, live in a household where no adult, kind of no parent, and neither the parent nor any other relative who's the head of household has any degree, any post-secondary degree. So no associate degree, no bachelor's degree. And so they really they're kind of on their own on this navigation. And that is further complicated for these children by the fact that their parents may have limited English ability. So one of the things that we see, so limited English ability is defined as speaking English less than very well. And we see that among our Hispanic children, about 3 in 10 parents have limited English speaking ability. 4% do not speak English at all, 12% speak it not well, 14% speak it well. Well, 38%, the largest share, say it's not their primary language, but they speak it very well. And another 32% only speak English. And again, this is going to be different from state to state. In North Carolina, a state with that relatively newer immigrant population, you know, we're more first generation and second generation Latino. We have fewer individuals who only speak English and more limited English ability. In a state like California or Florida, this is going to be a bit different. So just keep in mind that this is kind of the US average, and again, that this might look different from state to state. So we've covered kind of my high level stuff, and I want to open it up now for questions. I know that we've shared stuff out. This will also be shared. And I also encourage you, if you don't ask a question today, feel free to reach out to us and ask a follow-up question if we don't get a chance to get to it. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, I guess. So when I just saw some of the chats, yes, I believe I've told Juan and Deanna to feel free to share the slides and also the Excel file.
Yes, and somebody also asked, are you recording this so I can get it later? So they want to get you recorded with your cough. I'm so sorry you're coughing today, Becky.
I don't know what it is. I think it's the lack of humidity. You know, it's fall now.
Yep. West Coast folks are saying, whatever. Oh, thank you so much for that information. Does anybody have any questions? You know, I think for me, one of the reasons why I invited Becky to come and share this data is because we are constantly asked these types of questions when we're writing a grant for Juntos. So those graphs that you saw, those numbers, that becomes a story within itself. And I think that even as you've participated and have experienced today, earlier today, the students that talked, that was, I mean, the numbers were them, right? They're live human beings that are experiencing exactly what Becky just shared with you. And so when you can bring data and then tell a story, I think that that's really powerful in being able to engage a funder in the reality of what they're investing in. And so, Becky, I really do appreciate your time and the data that I have learned to appreciate data throughout my years. And I appreciate you for focusing so much on it, for sure.
Well, thank you. And I'll also flag that I'm going to be around through the rest of this session. So, you know, if people are thinking of stuff and want to shoot a message in the chat, I'll monitor it and can help, you know. I know often data questions are slow to come.
Absolutely.